Princess Kira stood in the grand throne room, her crimson scales catching the light from the three suns streaming through the massive windows. Around her, the most powerful warriors of the Draken Empire filled the hall, their armor gleaming, their eyes fixed on the small figure standing at the center of the room. That figure was James Carter, and he looked completely out of place. The Draken were legends across 12 star systems. They were born warriors, each one standing over 7 feet tall with natural armor plating, razor-sharp claws that could tear through steel, and strength that made them the most feared species in this sector of the galaxy. They had conquered worlds through sheer physical dominance. Their children trained in combat before they could properly walk. Weakness was not just discouraged in their culture, it was considered shameful, almost criminal. And now Kira, the Emperor's eldest daughter and the pride of the Scorched Throne, was being married off to a human. A creature that barely reached 6 feet tall. A species so fragile they needed machines to survive in most environments. A people who wore clothes because their own skin couldn't protect them from their own planet's weather. The peace treaty lay on the obsidian table between the two delegations. Decades of border skirmishes, resource disputes, and territorial conflicts would end today. All it required was a wedding. A symbolic union between two species to cement the alliance. And Kira had volunteered, believing it was her duty to her people, even if every instinct told her this was humiliating. James stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back, seemingly unbothered by the hostile stares from every direction. He wore a simple dark suit, formal by human standards but laughably inadequate by Draken measures. No armor, no weapons visible, no display of strength or dominance. He just stood there with a slight, polite smile on his face, waiting. General Vec, the Emperor's military advisor, leaned toward Kira's father and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "Your Majesty, are we certain this alliance is worth such a price?" The human looks like he would struggle to lift a training sword, let alone wield one. Ripples of laughter spread through the assembled nobles. Even the guards at the doors allowed themselves smirks. Kira felt her jaw tighten, her fangs grinding together. This was already worse than she had imagined. She would not just be married to a human, she would be married to one that her entire court viewed as a joke. James seemed to hear the comment but showed no reaction. His expression remained calm, almost serene. Either he didn't understand the insult, or he simply didn't care. Kira couldn't decide which possibility annoyed her more. Her younger brother Victor stood among the warrior elite, his massive frame decorated with scars from 100 battles. He caught her eye and shook his head slowly, a gesture of pity mixed with contempt. Victor had wanted to reject the treaty entirely, to settle things the Draken way, through continued combat until one side submitted completely. But their father had overruled him. The war was costing too much, and the humans, despite their physical weakness, had proven frustratingly difficult to defeat. They didn't fight honorably in open combat. They used drones, traps, long-range weapons, and tactics that the Draken considered cowardly but couldn't deny were effective. The wedding ceremony began with traditional Draken rites. The high priest, his scales white with age, called both Kira and James forward. The first test was the blood rite, an ancient tradition where both partners proved their commitment by cutting their own palms and mixing their blood in a ceremonial cup. It was meant to show courage, pain tolerance, and the willingness to sacrifice for the union. Kira stepped forward first. She extended her left hand, palm up, and drew her ceremonial blade across it without hesitation. The cut was deep, controlled, and she didn't flinch even slightly. Dark blue blood welled up immediately, dripping into the crystal cup below. The crowd murmured approval. This was expected of a princess of the Scorched Throne. Then it was James's turn. He stepped forward, and Kira saw something flicker across his face. Was it fear? Determination? She couldn't tell. He produced a small folding knife from his pocket, nothing ceremonial or impressive, just a simple tool. The crowd's murmurs turned skeptical. Some openly scoffed. James opened the blade with a practiced flick, positioned it against his palm, and made a single clean cut. His blood, bright red and so different from Draken blue, dripped into the cup alongside hers. And here was the surprising part, he didn't flinch either. His hand remained steady. His expression remained calm. He met the priest's eyes and nodded once, then stepped back. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a display of dominance. But it was competent, controlled, and showed zero hesitation. Kira found herself slightly impressed despite her reservations. At least he hadn't embarrassed her by fainting or crying out. The priest mixed their blood with the traditional chant, binding them by ancient law. The emperor stood and proclaimed them married before the assembled court. There was applause, but it was polite and formal rather than enthusiastic. Everyone present understood this was a political necessity, not a celebration. The reception that followed was even more uncomfortable. Long tables filled with Draken delicacies, roasted meats from dangerous prey animals, spiced dishes that would probably kill most species, and drinks strong enough to be flammable. James sat beside Kira at the high table, eating carefully, saying little, observing everything. Victor approached their table with a group of young warrior nobles, all of them flushed with drink and confidence. "Sister," he called out, his voice carrying across the hall, "I hope you've prepared separate sleeping quarters. Your new husband looks like he might break if you roll over in your sleep." The hall erupted in laughter. Kira's scales flushed darker with anger and embarrassment. This was exactly what she had feared, being mocked not for her own failures but for her husband's perceived weakness. She waited for James to respond, to defend himself, to show some spark of anger or pride. Instead, he simply continued eating, cut another piece of meat with precise movements, and took a sip of water. He acted as if he hadn't heard the insult at all. That reaction somehow made it worse. A Draken warrior would have challenged Victor immediately, demanded satisfaction, proven their worth. James's silence looked like cowardice to everyone watching. Kira felt her hope sinking. She had married not just a weak human, but apparently a passive one as well. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and if anything, Kira's opinion of her husband had only gotten worse. Not because James was cruel or disrespectful, actually, that was part of the problem. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in everything about Draken culture. But in a society built entirely around physical strength and warrior prowess, those qualities meant absolutely nothing. Every morning, Kira woke before dawn to train with her personal guard in the Royal Combat Arena. It was a massive space carved from volcanic rock, with training equipment that would crush most species. She sparred for 3 hours straight, wrestling opponents twice her size, practicing with bladed weapons until her arms burned, running obstacle courses designed to push Draken warriors to their absolute limits. And every morning, James was nowhere to be seen. At first, she thought maybe he was intimidated by the intensity of Draken training. That would be understandable, their warm-up routines would hospitalize most humans. But then she learned he wasn't avoiding exercise altogether. He just did it privately, locked away in a small room in their quarters, where nobody could see him. The servants whispered about it. They said they heard strange sounds from that room early each morning, rhythmic breathing, the shuffle of footsteps, occasional grunts of effort. But whenever anyone knocked, James would emerge looking perfectly composed, barely sweating, as if he'd just been reading or meditating. Whatever he was doing in there, it clearly wasn't real training. Not by Draken standards, anyway. The rest of his days followed a predictable pattern. James spent hours in the Imperial archives, buried in old manuscripts and historical records. He had become fascinated with Draken history, particularly their warrior traditions and the philosophical foundations of their combat culture. He asked the archivists endless questions, taking meticulous notes on everything. Some of the older scholars actually seemed to enjoy his visits, appreciating his genuine curiosity and thoughtful questions. But to the warrior class that dominated Draken society, this made him even more pathetic. Scholars were respected, but only if they were also warriors. A person who only studied, who never tested themselves in combat, was considered half-formed. Incomplete. James was living proof of human weakness, choosing dusty books over the glory of the arena. Kira tried to bridge this gap. One afternoon, she invited him to watch her training session, hoping maybe he'd be inspired to join, or at least to understand what being a warrior truly meant. James agreed immediately, seeming genuinely pleased by the invitation. He stood at the edge of the arena, that same small notepad in his hands, watching intently as Kira faced off against 3 opponents simultaneously. It was an advanced drill, designed to teach spatial awareness and threat management. Kira moved like a force of nature, her claws deflecting blade strikes, her tail sweeping legs, her raw power overwhelming her opponents through sheer physical dominance. When the session ended, she approached James, breathing hard but exhilarated. "So? What did you think?" "Impressive," he said, and he sounded sincere. "Your spatial awareness is remarkable. The way you tracked all 3 opponents simultaneously while managing your own positioning, it's extraordinary." Kira felt a small spark of pride, then noticed he was looking at his notes. "You were taking notes? During combat training?" "I hope you don't mind. I was analyzing the technique. Your culture has developed some fascinating approaches to multiple opponent scenarios. The way you use your tail as both a sensory tool and a weapon creates advantages that humans simply don't have." She stared at him. He'd been analyzing her like some kind of academic research project. James, you do understand that combat isn't something you study from the sidelines, right? It's something you do. Something you live. Of course, he nodded. Every culture expresses itself through its strengths. This is yours. It could be yours too, she said carefully. You could train with us. I could work with you personally, help you develop whatever potential you have. Something shifted in James's expression, just for a moment, so brief she almost missed it. Then his polite smile returned. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think I'd be much good at Draken-style combat. Our bodies are built differently. What works for your people wouldn't work for mine. It was a reasonable answer. It was probably even true. But it felt like a rejection, and worse, it felt like acceptance of weakness. Like he had already decided he couldn't measure up, so why bother trying? The court noticed everything, of course. In a palace full of warriors, there were no secrets. James's daily routines became common knowledge and constant sources of mockery. During state dinners, noble houses would make pointed comments within his earshot. I hear the human is quite the scholar, Lady Thera remarked loudly at one banquet. Tell me, Ambassador Carter, have you discovered any ancient texts that teach humans how to actually fight? I found several, actually, James replied evenly. Your people's combat treatises are remarkably sophisticated. The philosophical foundations alone could fill volumes. Philosophy, General Vex snorted. Yes, I'm sure that's very useful when someone is trying to tear your head off. Laughter rippled through the hall. James continued eating, apparently unbothered. Kira's claws dug into the table. She hated that she felt embarrassed. She hated that she felt the need to defend him. But most of all, she hated that he wouldn't defend himself. Victor was the worst. Her brother seemed to take personal offense at James's existence. He made it his mission to remind everyone at every opportunity that the royal family now included a weakling. During military strategy sessions that James attended as part of his ambassadorial duties, Victor would deliberately ask his opinion on combat tactics, then dismiss whatever James suggested as theoretical nonsense from someone who'd never held a real weapon. The servants weren't openly disrespectful, James was still royalty by marriage, but their contempt showed in subtle ways. They were slower to respond to his requests. They forgot to inform him of schedule changes. They served him last at meals, even though protocol dictated he should be served second after Kira. He never complained, never demanded better treatment, which somehow made it worse. His patience looked like powerlessness. Even Kira found herself feeling protective of him, which confused her. She didn't love James, how could she? They barely knew each other, and he seemed determined to remain this polite, distant presence in her life. But he was genuinely kind to her. He asked about her day, remembered details she mentioned in passing, and treated her as an intellectual equal rather than just a warrior princess. That was rare among Draken males, who typically viewed females solely through the lens of combat capability. Late at night, when they were alone in their quarters, James would ask her questions about Draken culture that actually made her think. Not surface-level questions about weapons or tactics, but deeper ones. Why did her people value individual combat so highly when modern warfare was increasingly technological? How did their warrior culture adapt when they first encountered species that fought differently? What was it like growing up knowing that physical strength would determine so much of her social standing? These conversations were nice, interesting, even. But they didn't change the fundamental problem. James was intelligent and kind, but in Draken society, those qualities without physical strength made him irrelevant at best, contemptible at worst. Then came the incident that changed everything. During a formal state dinner with representatives from multiple allied worlds, Victor stood up with a ceremonial challenge cup in his hand. Kira's blood went cold. She knew what was coming. "Brother James," Victor called out, his voice carrying across the entire hall. "You have been part of our family for 3 months now. You have studied our culture, observed our traditions, and enjoyed our hospitality. I think it's time you participated in one of our most sacred customs." He raised the cup higher. "I challenge you to single combat. 3 days from now, in the great arena, before all who wish to witness. Do you accept?" The hall went absolutely silent. Every eye turned to James. A formal challenge couldn't be refused without profound dishonor, not just to the person challenged, but to their entire family. Victor had trapped him perfectly. Kira saw genuine fear flash across James's face for the first time since she'd met him. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. For several long seconds, he didn't speak. Then, Quietly, barely above a whisper, he said, "I accept." Victor's grin was savage with triumph. The hall erupted in excited conversation. Kira felt her heart sink into her stomach. In 3 days, she would watch her husband be humiliated, possibly injured, definitely broken in front of the entire court. And there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The 3 days before the duel were the longest of Kira's life. She tried everything she could think of to stop what was coming. She went to her father, the emperor, and begged him to intervene. He refused, explaining that a formal challenge, once accepted, could not be withdrawn without bringing shame upon the entire royal house. She tried appealing to Victor directly, catching him in the training hall and asking him to reconsider. He just laughed and told her that James needed to learn what it meant to be Draken, even if the lesson was painful. She even considered going to James himself, suggesting he claim illness or diplomatic emergency, anything to avoid the fight. But every time she thought about it, she realized how that would look. It would confirm everything the court already believed about humans. That they were cowards. That they couldn't be trusted or respected. That the alliance was a mistake. James himself seemed strangely calm during those 3 days. He continued his normal routine, morning exercise in his private room, hours in the archives, quiet evenings in their quarters. The only change was that he stopped attending public functions. He took his meals privately, avoided the common areas of the palace, and spoke even less than usual. On the second night, Kira couldn't take the silence anymore. She found him sitting by the window in their quarters, looking out at the 3 moons hanging in the purple sky. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "There are ways out. We could claim you're needed for urgent diplomatic matters. We could." "I accepted the challenge," James interrupted gently. "I gave my word." "Your word means nothing if you're dead." Kira's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Victor is one of the finest warriors in the Empire. He's been training since he was 3 years old. He's killed enemy soldiers in actual combat. And you?" She trailed off, not wanting to say what they both knew. "And I'm a human who spends his time reading books," James finished for her. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a statement of fact. "I know what everyone thinks, Kira. I've known since the day I arrived." "Then why did you accept? You could have found a way to refuse. Taken the Dishina. It would have been better than being torn apart in front of thousands of spectators." James turned to look at her, and she was surprised to see he was actually smiling slightly. "Maybe. But I made a promise when I married you. I promised to honor your culture, to become part of your world. Running away from this challenge wouldn't honor anything. It would just confirm what everyone already suspects, that humans don't belong here." Kira felt something crack inside her chest. This stupid, stubborn, gentle man was going to get himself killed because he was too proud or too foolish to run. "There's no shame in recognizing your limitations," she said desperately. "You're not Draken. You can't fight like us. Everyone knows that." James stood up and walked over to her. He was so much smaller than her, the top of his head barely reaching her shoulder. But when he looked up at her, his eyes were steady and unafraid. "Thank you for caring," he said softly. "That means more than you know. But I'll be fine. Trust me." She wanted to believe him. But she'd seen him every day for 3 months. She knew he wasn't a warrior. And in 2 more days, everyone else would see it too. The morning of the duel arrived with clear skies and perfect weather. By Draken standards, it was a beautiful day for combat. The great arena had been used for ceremonial battles for over 1,000 years. It was a massive oval carved directly into the side of a mountain, with stone seats rising in tiers that could hold 50,000 spectators. Today, it looked like every single seat was filled. Kira sat in the royal box beside her father, her claws digging grooves into the stone armrest without her even realizing it. All around them, nobles and military officials chatted excitedly. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a lesson. A reminder that the natural order of the universe favored the strong, and that humans, despite their technology and treaties, were not strong. The arena floor was bare stone, smooth and flat, with no obstacles or cover. Traditional dueling space. Victor entered from the north gate, and the crowd roared approval. He wore full ceremonial battle armor, polished to a mirror shine, with the royal crest emblazoned across his chest. In his hands, he carried a plasma-edged greatsword, the blade shimmering with barely contained energy. It was a weapon that required immense strength just to lift, let alone wield effectively. Victor spun it casually, showing off, and the crowd loved it. Then James entered from the south gate, and the noise in the arena shifted to something between laughter and disbelief. He wore simple black clothing, flexible pants and a long-sleeved shirt, nothing ceremonial or impressive. No armor. No visible weapons. He walked to the center of the arena with that same calm expression he always wore, his hands empty at his sides. "Is the human planning to bore my son to death with philosophy?" someone shouted from the crowd, triggering waves of laughter. The duel master, an ancient Draken warrior covered in scars from a lifetime of combat, stepped between the two fighters. His voice boomed across the arena, magically amplified. "This is a formal challenge under traditional law. The duel ends at first blood. First blood is defined as a wound serious enough to scar. Both fighters have agreed to these terms. Do you both confirm?" "Confirmed," Victor said loudly, grinning at the crowd. "Confirmed," James said quietly. The duel master looked at James with something that might have been pity. "Human, you carry no weapon. Do you wish to withdraw?" "No," James replied. "I'm fine as I am." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Was he planning to fight a Draken warrior completely unarmed? That wasn't courage, that was suicide. The duel master shook his head slowly, then raised his hand. "Fighters, take your positions." He waited until both had stepped back to the marked circles on the arena floor. Then his hand dropped. "Begin." Victor didn't waste time with posturing. He charged immediately, covering the distance between them in 3 massive strides, his great sword raised for a devastating overhead strike that would end the fight instantly. The blade came down with enough force to crack the stone floor. It hit nothing but empty ground. James wasn't there anymore. He'd moved, not frantically scrambling away, but with precise, economical motion. He was suddenly 3 feet to the left, as if he'd simply decided to occupy a different space. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't even breathing hard. The crowd's laughter died instantly. Victor snarled and spun, bringing the massive sword around in a horizontal slash that would have cut a normal person in half. Again, James moved. Not a desperate dive or panic jump, just fluid motion that put him exactly where the blade wasn't. He slipped inside Victor's guard by less than an inch, so close that the energy field around the sword's edge stirred his hair. Then James did something that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. As he moved past Victor, his hand reached out and touched, just touched, Victor's sword wrist. It was barely contact, just a brush of fingers. But Victor's grip faltered for a fraction of a second, and the massive greatsword dipped slightly off course. Victor roared in frustration and unleashed a flurry of attacks. Overhead strike, side slash, upward cut, spinning strike, every technique he'd mastered over decades of training. The crowd watched in growing silence as James avoided every single one. He didn't block, didn't parry, didn't counter. He just wasn't there when the attacks arrived. It was eerie. Unnatural. Like watching someone phase through reality itself. James's movements were so small, so precise, that he seemed to be barely moving at all. But Victor's blade never touched him. Not once. 2 minutes into the fight, Victor was breathing hard. His attacks were still powerful but becoming less controlled, driven by frustration rather than technique. He was expending enormous energy with every swing of that heavy weapon, while James had done nothing but walk and occasionally step. 3 minutes in, Victor was genuinely angry. Sweat poured down his scaled face. His attacks grew wilder, more desperate. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. This wasn't what anyone had expected. This wasn't a warrior defeating a weakling. This was something else entirely, something they didn't have words for. Then Victor made a mistake. He committed fully to a double-handed thrust, putting all his strength behind it, certain that this time he couldn't miss. James stepped forward instead of back, moving inside the strike's range where the blade couldn't reach him. And his hand moved to his waist. There was a sound, a soft, metallic whisper, that somehow carried across the entire silent arena. The sound of a blade leaving its sheath. Everyone saw it emerge. A sword, curved and simple, with no energy field or technological enhancements. Just polished steel that caught the sunlight and held it like captured fire. The entire arena held its breath as James stood there, weapon finally drawn, and everything about him had changed. The transformation was instant and complete. One moment, James was the quiet scholar everyone had dismissed for 3 months. The next moment, he was something entirely different. His posture changed, not dramatically, but in ways that anyone who'd spent a lifetime fighting could recognize. His weight shifted onto the balls of his feet. His shoulders relaxed while his core tightened. His eyes, which had always seemed distant and contemplative, suddenly became focused with absolute clarity. The sword he held was like nothing in the Draken arsenal. No power source, no glowing edges, no technological enhancements whatsoever. Just a curved blade of folded steel, about 30 inches long, with a simple wrapped handle. It looked ancient, primitive even. But the way it caught the light was mesmerizing. The metal had been polished to such perfection that it reflected the arena like a mirror, showing distorted images of the crowd, the sky, and Victor's stunned face. Victor had frozen in place, his warrior's instinct recognizing something his mind couldn't quite process. That blade shouldn't have been threatening. By every logical measure, his plasma-edged greatsword was superior in every way, longer reach, more cutting power, enhanced with technology that could slice through reinforced steel like paper. But something primal in his combat-trained brain was screaming warnings. The crowd was absolutely silent. 50,000 Draken warriors, the most feared fighting species in 12-star systems, sat in complete stillness. Some later said they felt it in that moment, a shift in the arena's atmosphere, like the pressure change before a storm. This wasn't going to be the execution they'd expected. This was something else. James stood perfectly still, the sword held in a ready position that looked almost casual but was anything but. His grip on the handle was relaxed yet secure. The blade angled slightly downward and to his right. His breathing was slow and controlled. Everything about his stance suggested someone who had held this weapon not for hours or days, but for years. Maybe decades. Victor recovered first, his pride overriding his instinct. "So the human has a toy sword," he snarled, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Let's see if you actually know how to use it." He attacked again, but this time with more caution. Instead of wild, powerful swings, he used controlled strikes, testing James's defense. A quick thrust toward the chest. A slash at the legs. A faint high followed by a real attack low. These were proper techniques, the kind taught to advanced students, designed to probe an opponent's weaknesses. James responded to each one with minimal movement. His blade moved in small, precise arcs, redirecting Victor's strikes rather than blocking them directly. When Victor thrust, James's sword guided it past his body by inches. When Victor slashed, the curved blade caught the plasma edge and turned it aside with what seemed like effortless timing. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. Every movement served a purpose. Kira found herself leaning forward in her seat, her earlier dread transforming into something else, fascination mixed with disbelief. She'd watched thousands of duels in her lifetime. She knew combat the way scholars knew books. And what she was seeing now was mastery. Not the overwhelming power that Draken warriors valued, but something equally impressive, absolute technical perfection. The duel master, standing at the arena's edge, had his hand hovering near the bell that would signal the match's end. His ancient eyes were wide with surprise. In his long lifetime, he'd seen every fighting style the Draken had developed, plus dozens of techniques from other warrior species. But this was different. This was something that didn't rely on natural advantages or physical superiority. This was pure skill, refined to an art form. Victor was getting desperate now. He could feel it slipping away, not just the duel, but his entire understanding of combat. He'd trained since childhood under the Empire's greatest masters. He'd won tournaments, survived real battles, earned every scar on his body through blood and pain. And now he couldn't touch this human. Couldn't even make him step backward. He roared and launched a combination attack he'd been saving, a sophisticated sequence that combined high and low strikes, feints and real attacks, designed to overwhelm any defense through sheer complexity. It was a technique that required immense strength and perfect timing, the kind of move that only elite Draken warriors could execute. James moved through it like water flowing around stones. His feet shifted in small, precise steps. His blade wove patterns in the air, each one perfectly timed to intercept Victor's sword at the exact moment and angle needed to redirect it. And then, in the middle of Victor's combination, James did something that made the crowd gasp. He stepped forward. Not back, not sideways, forward, into Victor's space, closing the distance instead of maintaining it. It was a move that seemed suicidal, putting himself within range of Victor's claws and physical strength. But it also put him too close for Victor's massive sword to be effective. Victor, committed to his attack sequence, couldn't adjust fast enough. His blade passed behind James's shoulder, missing by less than 2 inches. They were face to face for a moment, Victor towering over the smaller human, close enough that the Draken could have grabbed him with his free hand. But that moment was all James needed. His sword moved in a single cut, not a wild slash or powerful chop, but a precise, controlled motion that looked almost gentle. The blade traced a line through the air, following a path that had been practiced so many times it was more memory than thought. It was a draw cut, using the curve of the blade to maximize cutting efficiency while minimizing required force. The edge touched Victor's ceremonial armor just below the collarbone and traveled diagonally across his chest. Draken armor was designed to stop most weapons, but this wasn't about power, it was about precision. The blade found the microscopic gaps in the armor's construction, the weak points where plates connected, and passed through as if they weren't there. Victor stopped moving. His sword lowered slowly. He looked down at his chest and saw a thin red line cutting across his armor and the scales beneath. Blood, dark blue Draken blood, welled up from the cut and began to drip down his chest plate. First blood. The duel was over. James's sword returned to its sheath with the same soft whisper it had made when drawn. The motion was smooth and practiced, done without looking, guided by muscle memory so deeply ingrained it was automatic. He took a step back and bowed to Victor, a formal, respectful gesture that acknowledged his opponent's skill and courage. Victor stood frozen, staring at the blood on his chest. His face showed confusion, disbelief, and something else, the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness was wrong. The arena remained silent for several long seconds. Then the duel master struck the bell, the clear tone ringing out across the space. First blood, he announced, his ancient voice filled with awe. Victory to Ambassador James Carter of Earth. Still, the crowd didn't react. 50,000 warriors sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. A human, a species they'd considered weak, soft, barely worthy of respect, had just defeated one of the Empire's finest warriors. And he'd done it without breaking a sweat, without apparent effort, using nothing but skill refined to a level they hadn't imagined possible. James turned and began walking toward the south gate, the same calm expression on his face he'd worn since entering. As if he'd just finished a routine training exercise rather than proving everything the Draken believed about humans was incomplete at best, completely wrong at worst. Kira realized her claws had carved deep furrows in the stone armrest. Her hearts were pounding. Her scales had flushed with colors she hadn't displayed since adolescence, colors associated with attraction, respect, and primal recognition of a worthy mate. She had just watched her weak husband do something impossible. And everyone in the Empire had witnessed it too. The silence in the arena finally broke. It didn't start with cheers or applause, it started with murmurs. Quiet conversations between warriors who couldn't quite believe what they'd just seen. The murmurs grew louder, spreading through the crowd like ripples in water. Then someone in the upper sections began a slow, rhythmic clapping. Others joined. Within moments, the entire arena was filled with the sound of 50,000 Draken warriors acknowledging what had just happened. It wasn't the wild celebration they usually gave their own champions. This was different, more thoughtful, more stunned. It was the sound of people having their worldview challenged and being forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Kira stood up from the royal box, her legs feeling unsteady for the first time in years. She needed to find James. She needed answers. She needed to understand how the quiet man who spent his days reading in libraries had just moved like that, fought like that, won like that. She found him back in their quarters, sitting by the same window where they'd talked 2 nights before. He'd changed out of his combat clothes into his usual simple attire. The sword, that incredible, ancient blade, lay across his lap. He was cleaning it with a soft cloth, his movements careful and reverent, treating the weapon like it was something precious. "You lied to me," Kira said from the doorway. Her voice wasn't angry, just confused. "All this time, you let everyone think you were weak. You let them mock you, insult you, treat you like you were nothing. Why?" James looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never noticed before. It wasn't weakness or fear. It was patience. Deep, unwavering patience. "I never lied," he said quietly. "I just didn't volunteer information that wasn't asked for." "That's not an answer." Kira walked into the room, her tail lashing with agitation. "You're clearly a trained warrior. That level of skill doesn't come from nowhere. How long have you been training?" James set down the cleaning cloth and looked at the sword in his hands. "This blade belonged to my grandfather. He studied swordsmanship for 53 years under masters who had themselves studied for decades. It's a tradition on Earth called Kenjutsu, the art of the sword. My grandfather started teaching me when I was 6 years old. I'm 34 now. So, 28 years. The number hit Kira like a physical blow. 28 years of training. That was longer than many Draken warriors lived. 28 years, she repeated. And in all that time, in 3 months of living here, you never once mentioned this? Never showed anyone what you could do. Why would I? James's question was genuinely curious, not defensive. Your people already had opinions about humans. Me showing off combat skills wouldn't have changed those opinions, it would have just made everyone uncomfortable. They needed time to see that humans could contribute in other ways first. Through diplomacy, cultural exchange, genuine interest in your civilization. But they mocked you every single day. I know. James smiled slightly. I heard every comment, every joke, every insult. But Kira, on Earth, we have a saying, empty vessels make the most noise. The people who are truly dangerous, truly skilled, don't need to announce it constantly. They don't need to prove themselves in every interaction. They simply exist, and when the moment comes that requires their skill, they act. Kira sat down on the bench across from him, her mind racing. That blade. The way you moved. I've studied combat my entire life, and I've never seen anything like it. That's because it's not Draken combat, James explained. Your people developed fighting techniques based on your natural advantages, strength, claws, armored scales, size. Why wouldn't you? It makes perfect sense. But humans don't have any of those advantages. We're weak by comparison to most species in the galaxy. So we had to develop something different. He held up the sword, letting the light play across its polished surface. This weapon and the techniques that go with it were refined over thousands of years on Earth. Not by people who were naturally strong, but by people who understood that precision could overcome power. That technique could defeat raw strength. That patience and practice could create abilities that genetics never gave us. But why keep it hidden? Kira asked again. You could have gained respect immediately if you'd just shown people what you could do. James shook his head. Respect earned through intimidation isn't real respect. It's just fear wearing a different mask. I wanted your people to respect humans for our minds first, our culture, our contributions to civilization. The fighting ability, that's just one tool in the kit. An important one, yes, but not the only one that matters. Over the following days, the footage from the duel spread across the entire Draken Empire. Every military academy analyzed it. Warrior scholars broke down James's movements frame by frame, trying to understand the principles behind what he'd done. Philosophers debated what it meant that such perfection could exist without natural advantages, created purely through human determination and time. Young Draken warriors started asking questions. If humans could achieve that level of skill through training alone, what could Draken achieve if they applied the same dedication to refining technique rather than just relying on their natural strength? Some of the more progressive military academies actually requested human combat instructors, wanting to learn these strange earth-fighting arts. The political implications were enormous. Other species in the region who had dismissed humans as weak suddenly reconsidered. Trade negotiations that had been stalled for months suddenly moved forward. Diplomatic meetings that humans had struggled to get attendance for were now oversubscribed. Everyone wanted to understand this species that hid such capability behind such quiet demeanor. But the biggest change was in the royal palace itself. The servants who had been dismissive now showed genuine respect. Noble houses that had mocked the marriage alliance now sought meetings with James, picking his brain about strategy, philosophy, and the human approach to problem-solving. Even General Vec, who had questioned the alliance from the beginning, requested a private meeting to discuss human military tactics. Victor himself came to their quarters a week after the duel. His chest wound had healed cleanly, it had been precise enough not to cause serious damage, just enough to draw the required blood. He stood in their doorway looking awkward, something Kira had never seen from her normally confident brother. I owe you an apology, Victor said stiffly. I judged you without knowledge. I assumed weakness where there was only restraint. That was dishonorable of me. James stood and bowed slightly. You were operating on the information you had. There's no dishonor in that. I appreciate you coming here. Would you? Victor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Would you teach me? Some of what you know? I've watched the recording 100 times and I still don't fully understand how you moved like that. Kira watched as James smiled, a genuine, warm smile she'd rarely seen. I'd be honored. But I should warn you, it's not about learning specific moves. It's about understanding principles. It takes time. Years, actually. I have time, Victor said firmly. If a human can spend 28 years perfecting their art, surely a Draken can show the same dedication. And that was how it started. James began teaching small classes in the palace, sharing human martial philosophy with warriors who had previously mocked him. He didn't teach them to fight like humans, their bodies were too different for that. Instead, he taught them the principles: efficiency of motion, Precise timing, reading opponents, using minimal force for maximum effect. Kira joined these classes, training alongside her brother and others. She found herself seeing combat in entirely new ways. All her life, she'd relied on her natural strength and speed. Now she was learning to think 3 moves ahead, to make every motion count, to win through intelligence as much as power. More importantly, she was learning about her husband. The quiet man who read books in libraries had depths she'd never imagined. He was a warrior, yes, but also a philosopher, a teacher, a diplomat who understood that sometimes the best victories were the ones achieved without fighting at all. One evening, months after the duel, she sat with him by their window watching the 3 moons rise. "I need to apologize too," she said quietly. "I judged you from the first day. I thought you were weak. I was embarrassed to be married to you." James took her hand, his soft, unclawed, human hand. "You were operating on the information you had," he said, echoing what he'd told Victor. "Besides, I understand why you thought that. In a society built around physical strength, I didn't fit the pattern. But Kira, strength takes many forms. Physical power is one. But there's also strength of patience, strength of character, strength of will, strength of commitment to principles even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong. You have all of those," Kira said, realizing it was true. "You stood there for 3 months letting people mock you, waiting for the right moment to show them who you really were." "Not to show them," James corrected gently. "To teach them. There's a difference. Showing off is about ego. Teaching is about helping others grow." 2 years later, their daughter was born. She was extraordinary, covered in fine scales like her mother, with strength beyond any human child, but she moved with the precise, economical grace of her father. The medical staff marveled at how the genetics had combined. She had the best of both species. But more than that, she represented something new. A bridge between 2 cultures, 2 philosophies of strength. She would grow up understanding that power and precision weren't opposed, they were complementary. That natural advantages were wonderful, but they meant nothing without the discipline to use them well. The alliance between the Draken Empire and the Terran Coalition grew stronger every year. Trade flourished. Cultural exchange programs brought humans and Draken together. Joint military operations combined Draken strength with human tactics, becoming unstoppable. But on quiet evenings, when the palace was still and the 3 moons hung in the purple sky, Kira would sometimes ask James to draw his sword. Not to fight or practice, but just to watch. That perfect, practiced motion, the whisper of steel leaving its sheath, the blade catching moonlight like captured stars, the grace of 10,000 repetitions refined into something almost sacred. It reminded her of the lesson she'd learned. That the quietest people could be the most dangerous. That patience was its own kind of power. That sometimes the greatest strength was knowing when not to use your strength at all. The alien princess had thought her human husband was weak. She'd been completely, utterly wrong. He wasn't weak, he had simply been waiting. And when the moment came, when strength was truly required, he had shown everyone that humans didn't need natural weapons to be warriors. They just needed time, dedication, and the will to perfect their craft. That, Kira realized, might be the most terrifying thing about humans. They didn't accept their limitations, they worked for centuries to overcome them. And they did it so quietly that by the time you realized how dangerous they'd become, it was already too late.